Well, Halloween is here, and it's time to talk about Monster of the Week again. You guys really seem to like my videos on this system, and that's great. It's awesome to see that so many people are playing this game, and I have plenty more to say about it. Specifically, one of the biggest problems I've run into as a keeper is finding a cool concept for a monster session after session. In most RPGs, you can basically pick one big bad and a couple supporting villains and stick with them for the entire campaign. But in Monster of the Week, you're usually expected to come up with a new baddie in every single episode, and that can get pretty overwhelming after a while. So in this video, I've decided to list 5 mythological creatures that can make excellent antagonists in your Monster of the Week campaign, along with some inspiration on how to integrate them into your setting. But before I get into that, I want to run through what makes a good monster in this game. To me, a great monster should be 4 things. The first is scary. It should be obvious to the players that this creature is bad news, and that it's dangerous for the hunters to challenge it. The second is recognizable. Your players should have some familiarity with the creature, or at least something that resembles it, which will make the investigation process much more engaging and rewarding. Thirdly, the creature should have room to be integrated into the modern world. There should be a place for the monster to lurk in the shadows and prey upon unsuspecting victims. Bonus points if it can serve as a metaphor for some harmful force in the real world. Finally, your monster should be interesting to fight. Ideally, the solution to defeating the monster shouldn't just be finding it and shooting it down. It should require some form of clever deduction, whether that's discovering a material weakness or tricking it into destroying or banishing itself. Many of your classic horror creatures, like vampires, werewolves, and ghosts, check off all 4 of these boxes. But those creatures have been used so many times that unless you have a really fresh take, they're gonna bore a lot of your players. But I can think of 5 creatures that also check off all those boxes, and that I really haven't seen in this kind of modern paranormal or horror setting. So let's get into it. First on the list is the Dullahan, also known as the Headless Horseman. Most people have heard of this creature, but I've found that many aren't aware of the stories behind it. The Dullahan comes from Irish mythology, and it shares many qualities with the Grim Reaper. It's said to endlessly ride its black horse until eventually stopping, calling out a person's name, and causing that person to perish instantly. While creepy, you might be skeptical about how much agency the player characters would have in an RPG session. But judging by my own sessions with the Dullahan, there's plenty of room for action. The Dullahan is said to be afraid of gold, which you can easily construe as its weakness. Even then, it might not be a matter of simply finding the creature and running at it with a gold dagger, since the Dullahan carries its own spine and uses it to lash out people's eyes. In my games with the Dullahan, I've also ditched the traditional black horse in favor of a battered old car that seems to drive around town in circles forever, in order to make the identity of the creature less obvious, and to set up the chilling reveal that the driver has no head. But you can certainly go with the classic Headless Horseman if that better fits the vibe of your game. Next up, we have the Golem, which most people will recognize from D&D style high fantasy, but not so much from urban fantasy or horror. But it turns out there's plenty of opportunity for the Golem to shine in more modern settings. If you imagine a being made entirely of hardened clay, you're looking at something that's incredibly strong and tough. Bullets and sword strikes probably won't stand a chance against such a creature, and it could crush human skulls with ease. Story-wise, a golem could potentially be an unflinching protector of the law. For instance, in one of my games, where the PCs were all college students, the golem was a super strict RA assigned by one of the major villains to try to keep them from leaving their dorm at night. But it's also possible to depict the golem as a tragic figure who kills people due to frustration of its halfway existence or some terrible rejection. The original Jewish folktales about golems are pretty diverse and can go either way. If your golem is a tragic figure, then it might be possible to calm it or subdue it through diplomacy or goodwill. But if hunters think it's just too dangerous to be left alive, then many stories claim that golems are animated by a paper inscription placed in their mouths by their creators. And if anyone were to pull it out, the golem would cease to be animated. Of course, reaching into the mouth of a superhuman fighting machine is much easier said than done. And on the topic of high fantasy creatures, I wanted to mention the dragon. On the surface, dragons might not seem like a good fit for Monster of the Week, mostly because it's hard to imagine how they could possibly manage to blend into modern society. Massive flying lizards are pretty easy to notice, but I think dragons can make fantastic villains if they work behind the scenes. Dragons are famous for hoarding wealth, so they can work great as corrupt CEOs or leaders of crazy cults and seemingly abandoned mines. As for combat, dragons don't have an iconic weakness like wooden stakes or silver bullets, but you can easily portray them as strong and tough enough that normal weapons just aren't going to take them down. To do that, the hunters might need to search out some sacred weapon, or find the dragon's weak point, maybe a place where it was damaged in the past. But before they find that weakness, dragons can be terrifying antagonists, and I seriously think the only reason why they're not more common in urban fantasy is because most urban fantasy TV shows just can't use them due to budgetary constraints, and you don't need to worry about that as a GM. Fourth on my list is the Kobold, which really shouldn't be seen as a coincidence based on the last entry. When most roleplayers hear the word Kobold, they think of the D&D monster, but the original creatures from Germanic mythology are actually quite different. These are household sprites, said to complete chores for humans in exchange for goodwill and favors. They're always quite mischievous, though, and their tricks can become downright lethal when they're insulted or neglected. The whimsical nature of kobolds gives you the opportunity to inject some humor into your game, at least as funny as filling the pantry with poisonous spiders or shoving needles down sleeping people's throats really is. It's hard to find information on how to kill kobolds, although you can certainly count them as fairies and say that cold iron will do the trick. Perhaps more interestingly, though, some myths say that a kobold's behavior depends on the virtue of a house's residents. So getting them to behave might be a matter of weeding the secret serial killer out of some quirky extended family, giving you a break from traditional monster hunting in favor of more of a murder mystery for one session. And last but not least, we have the Valravn, or the Wilderraven as it's sometimes called. This monster comes from Danish mythology, and it's essentially an evil spirit that's created when a raven feasts on the flesh of a fallen warrior. Unlike most of the entries on this list, most people at your table probably will have never heard of a Valravn. But I think that's still okay because ravens are so commonly associated with death and bad omens. The Valravn is said to take on the form of a nigh invincible humanoid warrior as soon as it consumes the blood of a child. So that's perfect as a countdown entry and as something for the hunters to try and prevent. It's also said to be highly intelligent and crafty, so it could be able to predict the hunter's every move and trick bystanders into exposing themselves to danger. As for weaknesses, it only flies by night, which suggests that it might be able to be defeated when exposed to sunlight. But if you're in the dark, watch out. So there you have it. 5 unexpectedly terrifying creatures right for the taking for your Monster of the Week campaign. Let me know what you think, and feel free to shout out your own favorite monster in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching, a like is always appreciated, and I'll see you all next time.